Imagine with me, you are the son of a king. Not just any king, the son of King Solomon the wise. Your father is so well known in the world at this time that people from all over come to listen, to sit under, to glean from his proverbs, from his wisdom. They come to witness the wealth and the power that is Israel at the height of its glory. And those that would maybe find themselves an enemy of Israel, an enemy of your father, are quick to offer tribute of gold, silver, whatever wealth. They will even offer their young daughters as a ransom and marriage alliances and other things to make sure that they won't find themselves an enemy of Israel under your father's reign. And your grandfather, man, you've grown up hearing stories about him, almost mythical in action. The slayer of giants, the one warrior king that could grasp victory from the jaws of defeat, winning battle after battle, a man after God's own heart, David. And from a very early age, you've been learning and from the best of the scholars that your father's kingdom has to offer. And you feel like they're measuring you against these two men, your grandfather, your father. And the question is will he have the warrior prowess of King David? Will he have the charisma, the wisdom of King Solomon? And it seems like maybe you're being found lacking. The weight of expectation is so heavy. And everybody wonders who you will be as king. Will it all come crashing down with you? And there's been whispers, wrestlings, if you will. The prophets of God who were once your father's allies are now his enemies. They're speaking powerfully against your father. They're saying he has done evil in the sight of the Lord because of his 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's just crazy, by the way. And because of this, it's led to idol worship. And it's become prevalent again in the kingdom of Israel. And they say he has done evil in the sight of the Lord. And they've spoken to his enemy, one enemy in particular named Jeroboam. And they've told this enemy of your father that the kingdom will be divided. And he will be king of Israel while by the line of David, your kingdom will only be Judah. But it's not going to happen during your father's reign. No, the prophets say it's going to happen when you become king. And if the weight of your father's expectations weren't enough, now he's looking at you. Do not let this happen. He tries to kill Jeroboam and destroy this threat so it can't grow. But Jeroboam flees to Egypt. And your father has passed away, and you are now king. And that's how we begin King Rehoboam's story today. We're in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." Something significant in this, right? Jeroboam's already been told he is going to be king of the divided nation. And yet he cares so deeply for the people that in humility he comes before King Rehoboam. Instead of just starting a rebellion, he comes before him and says, "Hey, if you will lighten the load, we will serve you." So to give you some context, towards the end of Solomon's reign, he became very frivolous. He was building things, making his kingdom more majestic, and it was at the cost of his people. There was heavy taxes, heavy forced labor. His people were almost a slave to the king. As a king, he had forgotten his first duty was to serve the people. No, the people served him. he reigned with power towards the end of his time. And so they come before Rehoboam and say, would you ease the burden? Not even totally take it away. Would you just ease it? Would you ease this? And so Rehoboam answered in verse 5, go away for 3 days and then come back to me. So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. How would you advise me to answer these people, he asked. They replied, if today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servant. But, love that word, Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the younger men who had grown up with him and were serving him. Today, one of the key observations I want to offer you in our text is Rehoboam's folly was rooted in insecurity that rejected wisdom, prioritized control, and ignored God, leading to division and disaster. Now, you might ask, how have I come to the conclusion that Rehoboam is an insecure man? Well, this is what I love about narratives. It gives you the opportunity with the context you have to put yourself in the shoes of the character. And Rehoboam, who we know was a real king, he lived with heavy expectations. Can you imagine following in the footsteps of your grandfather, King David, and your father, Solomon? And being told before you even became king, hearing the whispers that it was all going to come crashing down when you were king. Who could he trust? The amount of insecurity that must have been dwelling in this man is unimaginable to me. And the other reason I can see him very clearly as an insecure man is he goes to the elders. If he was an arrogant, prideful king, as we've been talking about, he would have heard the elders and been like, no, they're wrong. I'm going to go ahead with what I want. But no, he didn't just go to the elders. What did he do after? He went to the young men. In my experience, insecure people tend to keep going for advice until they hear what they want to hear. And if you don't believe me, I can tell you right now, I struggle with some insecurity. And that's been real in my life. I hear the wise advice from the elders. I'm like, oh, I need another opinion. And I keep seeking an opinion until maybe it's a little bit more comforting than what I just heard. Because isn't it true we often seek comfort over challenge or over growth? And sometimes we seek people that are going to affirm those things in us. And we see Rehoboam's first folly very clearly as he ignored wise advice. He ignored it entirely. He heard it, but he couldn't see it. And he decided to ignore it and go elsewhere. Here's what I believe. Rehoboam came into this meeting with Solomon's advisors, and he was hoping they would advise him like they did King Solomon. He was hoping to hear, you are as great as your father. You can continue to lead in the same way your dad did, and you can do it at an even better and higher level. But no, instead what they said is, you are not your father, so serve the people, and they will serve you. And see, for all of us, we can see how much strength this would have taken, how much this would have been a step in a strong direction that would make him actually a greater king than his dad, but he could not see this. All he heard is, I'm weaker. I'm less than. You know, to his defense, he lived in a time where the tension for a king to choose mercy and choose power or justice or what they considered was right, that's a tension he had to dwell in, because mercy often was considered a weakness in ancient times. Because to show mercy may give internal enemies the idea that they could get more from you, and external enemies the idea that you might be ripe for the plucking. So there is a tension here he's wrestling with. But again, what we know through history and what he would have known is a strong hand being too oppressive was fertile soil for rebellion to grow. But he heard the elders. And he could have listened, but his fear of his reputation, his fear of not being enough, his fear of what others might perceive, his fear of how people might see him, led him to ignore. Proverbs 29:25 says simply this: fear of man will prove to be a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is kept safe. A moment of honesty in my own life. One of the places of my deepest insecurities are in raising my 4 children. I want to be a good dad, and I often tell myself a story that I'm not. And I do that based on the perceptions of people around me. I look at how other people might perceive my kids, even at church, and they go, man, what is Pastor Matt teaching his kids at home? Is he even present? Is he even doing his job? I tell myself these stories, and my kids suffer for it sometimes, right? Because in my insecurity and my worry about how people might perceive me, I go in and I might discipline, or I might have a conversation that there's no reason to have. And this is a place I really wrestle with and struggle. And here's the deal. If I ignore wisdom, and I ignore the wisdom in my life that says, no, you're their father, other people are not their dad. God ordained you for this. Trust in that, be secure in that, seek him in it, and be less concerned about how people might perceive you. If I take hold of that and humble myself before a holy God, what might change? I've seen this as I work with young people. Relationships change, right? As kids grow older, they might fall out with one of their friends. One of them might be trying really hard to hold on to a relationship while another is kind of moving on. And they're told, hey, this friendship isn't your whole identity. But they're like, no, I'll be nothing without them. And they could hear all the wise advice, but their emotions, their state of being, their insecurity makes it hard for them to receive wise advice. I'd love to say this is just true for teenagers or true for younger people, but isn't this also true for us? Relationships go through seasons, but sometimes we try really hard to control the situation and maybe ignore wisdom. And that leads me to this question: who are we? Who are you? Who am I listening to? Are you seeking godly wisdom or just what you want to hear? You know, those who struggle with arrogance may give the appearance of listening, but rarely truly hear others. This is why I think King Rehoboam really struggled with insecurity and not arrogance, because I think his arrogance would have said, okay, I hear you elders, I'm going to do my own thing. But then you move on, and when we talk about insecurity, those who wrestle with insecurity tend to seek affirmation from those who already agree with them. Because Rehoboam's story doesn't stop here, does it? No, it says he goes and speaks to the young men that grew up with him. And we pick up in verse 9. He asked them, what is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, lighten the yoke your father put on us? The young men who had grown up with him. Again, we hear that, grown up with him. I think this is to indicate they knew his heart. They knew his insecurities. They knew the reality of what he wanted to hear. And it says, now tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. They played right on his insecurities, right? He wants to prove he's a greater king than his dad. He's better than his dad. He can do it. The kingdom won't be divided under his reign. It's not going to happen. He will show he has the ability. So tell him, your little finger is thicker than your father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I'll make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. We see King Rehoboam's second folly. He chose control over humility. He chose control over humility. I can't tell you how many times as I've sat with couples that are struggling in their marriage and in their relationship, how often it has something to do with deep insecurity in one of them. And that insecurity creates stories in their mind. Creates stories like, oh, my spouse loves being with their friends more than they love being with me. My spouse regrets ever marrying me. My spouse would rather not spend time with me, but do this instead. And a lot of times in those situations where they've received the wise advice of, hey, these deep insecurities you have, you need to bring them to a counselor. You need to work through them. You need to pray. You need to humble yourself before God. Because here's the thing, insecurity, just like arrogance, is a very self-focused thing. And what is the right response? And the healing response is humility. Even though they hear that wise advice, they can't hear it because of their deep insecurities. And what do they choose? They choose to control. Emotional manipulation runs rampant. Oh, I love you so much, I couldn't imagine going away for a weekend without you. Oh, I love you so much, I couldn't imagine not being there when we're all together in that relationship. Your friends should be my friends. It shouldn't be a separate thing. Oh man, you're texting them all the time. Why can't you just be present with me? Do you care about them more than you care about me? And the emotional manipulation starts, and the control begins. And instead of coming to a place of humility, admitting their deep insecurities, dealing with it, working through it, not giving that burden to somebody else, but dealing with the trauma from the past that led them there, they start to control the relationships around them. Just as King Rehoboam was trying to control the narrative of how the people saw him, how the people received him. Now, arrogance and insecurity, this form of pride where we're self-focused, I want you to know it just doesn't lead to these actions of aggressiveness. It also can lead to a passivity. We won't see that much with the kings except when idol worship is rampant and they do nothing about it. But we won't see a lot of the passivity as we look at the folly of kings. But there's a reality that I know a lot of arrogant people, prideful people, that they've just decided people are dumber than them and not worth their time. Just to be truly honest. And so for them, they're going to be passive in relationships. They're not going to be invested. And it's going to lead to a passivity where they don't even try or move to a place of humility. I've seen deep insecure people that say, I'm worthless. I'm never going to be enough. I don't amount to anything. And that insecurity also leads them to a passivity of not trying, not moving to a place God has called them to in humility, believing who Jesus says they are instead of what they think. A place of trusting him and humbling themselves. And that leads me to the question, how are you approaching the people in your life? Are you building trust through humility or causing strain through control? Humility strengthens relationship, while pride and force create distance. I can't tell you time and time again as I've watched people walk in relationships, whether it's young people or older people, if they would have just chose a place of humility, a choice of patience, a choice of working on the things that maybe they heard advice that needed to be dealt with in their own life, they would have sought challenge instead of comfort, how different their story could have been. As I've worked with teenagers, and I know we have some in this room, often something I see is 3 is a crowd. And you get to a place of deep insecurity. Does my 2 friends like each other more than they like me? And I've seen teenagers start rumors, rip one another apart, just make horrible situations in an effort to control their friendships and bring their friend back into relationship with them. And the reality is, are we going to choose control over humility? Because all we're doing when we choose this control is we're going to create distance. It's going to be worse. But Rehoboam's story doesn't end here. We have to move on to verse 12. 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam as the king had said. Come back to me in 3 days. And the king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given to him by the elders. He followed the advice of the young men and said, my father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people. For this turn of events was from the Lord to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah the Shilonite. When all of Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, what share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David. So the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get in his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. One of the greatest follies of almost all the kings we'll look at, and even King Solomon later in his king, is where in that piece of the text did you ever hear mention that Rehoboam consulted the prophets of God or consulted God for direction? His third folly is he ignored God. He ignored God. As I was working through this text this week, I was imagining how the story could have been different. Picture this with me. Rehoboam starts to hear the whispers, the statements that the kingdom will be divided because of his father's sin, his father turning away from the one true God. And because of his father's sin, the kingdom is going to be divided. What if in that moment Rehoboam went before God and said, let it be because of my father's sin that this kingdom is divided, not my failings. God, whether I'm only king of Judah or king of all of Israel, let me follow after you. May you direct my steps. May you guide my paths. May you be with my father. May you be with me like you were my father at the beginning of his reign. Or what if after all this took place, after the division of the kingdom, after everything had happened, what happens if he would have chose humility then? What happens if the story ended King Rehoboam was confronted with his sin and repented? And all of Judah, along with their king, pursued God. And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. See, this is what the beauty of the gospel is. This is what I love about the gospel. This is what I love about our God. Our story is not done. If you have chosen arrogance or you've chosen insecurity, if you've let those lead your lives, a lot of times what we can do is we can fall in the same trap Rehoboam's did. I can't admit I was a bad king. I can't admit I made the wrong choice. I can't admit that it's because of me that everything came crashing down. But can I tell you, it is because of me that certain relationships in my life have been destroyed and divided. We love to say it takes two to fight. Can I tell you, sometimes one person is 98% of the problem? Now, if you're nudging your spouse, that's not the right thing to do. But there's this reality. There is this reality that we might say it takes two, but sometimes we have more ownership. And there have been friendships and relationships in my youth and my arrogance, in my insecurities, that I have been the cause of their division. And the question is I'm going to take the opportunity to learn, or am I going to respond like Rehoboam and just continue on in my arrogance, or continue on in my insecurities and feed them and never move to a place of growth and humility? Listen, as I've worked through the humility of repenting of those, as I've talked to the people I've hurt, the relationships I have been part of dividing or destroying, they're never going to be restored to what they were. But the act of humbling myself has brought me closer to my Savior and my Lord and given me the ability to be in better and right relationships from here, in the here and now. What if God has something to teach us in those moments? What if in our failings and even in our sins, it can draw us closer to Jesus because we pursue him above all else? We don't ignore him. We don't let our insecurities say we're not enough. We say, no, but Jesus is enough. We totally surrender to him in humility. We come before him and we say, God, I don't feel like I'm enough, but you tell me you came to die for me. You loved me enough to come to this earth, to live a life that was perfect, to die on a cross so that I might be in right relationship with you. You care that deeply about me. And even though I sit here and in my insecurities, I feel like I'm not enough, you say I am enough because you have paid the price. And if I'm not enough, you're enough. Jesus, I surrender it all to you. I give it all to you. Be Lord of my life. Yes, not everything is going to be restored. The relationships that I have destroyed, the relationships that you may have destroyed, the destruction you have wrought is going to be there. One of the hardest things and one of the greatest privileges I get in my life is I have watched kids, because I've been doing ministry for such a long time, become adults. And I sit with them and they talk about some of the struggles and trauma that they had in their childhood with parents that had the greatest of intentions. It's probably where some of my insecurity comes for as a dad, because I get to walk with people. And they talk about how they go to their parents and have conversation with them and talking about them. And their parents cannot come to a place of humility to say, yeah, maybe I could have done that differently. They're just like, I did the best I could. And don't get me wrong, that might be true, but that's not always helpful. There's an opportunity for each person to grow in this moment. There's an opportunity for that person to realize, yeah, they did the best they could with what they knew. But there's also a reality to know that if I knew what I did today, I probably would have done that differently. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for that. Will you forgive me? Can we move to a place of healing? And that leads me to the question, are we looking for what God might be doing in our situation, in your situation, or are you just pushing ahead with your own plans? You know, insecurity, just like arrogance, makes us lean on our own understanding instead of trusting God's direction. One of my favorite verses, one I try to recite as I'm making decisions, as I'm moving into relationships in difficult moments, is just Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. And it just says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge or submit to him, and he will make your path straight. There's this reality. There's this reality on how much do we trust what God says. And are we going to move into his path, into his ways, and acknowledge him? Or are we going to try to push ahead in our deep-seated insecurities or maybe our arrogance? In the places of self-centered focus. Pride isn't always about arrogance. It can actually be a mask for deep insecurity. And when we feel like we need to prove ourselves, we often ignore wisdom, seek validation in the wrong places, and choose control over humility. The irony in trying to hold on to things, relationships, power, whatever, we often lose it, just as Rehoboam lost half of his kingdom. Or more than half. The kingdom was divided. In a moment here, we're going to enter into a time of communion and response, where we'll take the Lord's Supper together. The ushers are going to come in here in a moment, and they're going to get elements for whoever didn't get elements on their way in. So if you didn't receive elements or didn't grab them on your way in, as you see the ushers come in, just raise your hand and they'll get them to you. But as we prepare ourselves for communion, the worship team's going to come out, and they're going to start playing. And I'm just going to invite you, even right now, if you want to prepare the elements, we're going to spend a minute or two just reflecting prayerfully on 3 questions I have back here. And these are going to be our reflection questions for today. And are there areas in your life where insecurity is making you choose control over humility? How can you trust God instead of proving yourself? Where in your life is insecurity making you ignore God, and how can you choose trust over fear? And the last one is one that I think is a really good practice when we come to the Lord's Supper, before we take it, as we remind ourselves that he has paid the price so that we might know forgiveness. Is there any sin in your life that you need to confess and turn from before taking the Lord's Supper?